You're listening to The Resilient Animal. I'm Annie Petersen, Doctor of Education with a Master's in Mental Health Recovery and Trauma-Informed Care. This podcast is an exploration of how helping other living beings can benefit human mental health and well-being, and what makes us all resilient animals. Today, we're diving into a topic that stretches from the oldest myths ever told to the novels you're reading right now. Animals, they are everywhere in literature. They prowl through our fables and fairy tales. They swim in the depths of our greatest novels. They soar through poetry. They curl up at the feet of our most beloved heroes. But why? Why, across every culture, every century, every literary tradition, do writers return again and again to the animal kingdom? Is it because animals reflect something back at us? Some part of ourselves we can only see clearly when we borrow the form of a fox, a whale, or a spider? Or is it the opposite? That animals represent everything we are not, everything wild and free and unconstrained by language and law and moral obligation. Today, we're going to explore both of those questions and everything in between. We'll travel from the ancient fables of Aesop and the Panchatantra through the great symbolic creatures of the 19th century into the beloved animals of children's literature, the politically charged beasts of dystopian fiction, and finally into the complex, morally fraught animal encounters of contemporary writing. This is a journey through thousands of years of human storytelling, and animals will be our guides every step of the way. Long before there were novels, before there were printing presses, before there was even a widely shared concept of literature as we know it, human beings were telling stories about animals. The reasons were practical at first. Animals were everywhere. They were the sources of food, the instruments of labor, the threats in the darkness beyond the fire. To survive, you needed to understand them. And to understand them, you told stories about them. But very quickly, and we're talking about the earliest oral traditions here, going back potentially tens of thousands of years, animals stopped being just animals in stories. They became something more. They became mediums. Let's start with the tradition most Western readers know best, Aesop's Fables. Aesop is one of those fascinating historical figures who may or may not have actually existed. Ancient sources describe him as a slave in ancient Greece, possibly from around the 6th century BCE, who gained fame for his wit and his storytelling. Whether the historical Aesop wrote any of the fables attributed to him is genuinely uncertain. What we know is that a vast collection of short tales, built around animal characters, has been associated with his name for over 2,000 years, and the format, once you encounter it, is unmistakable. A tortoise and a hare race each other, and the hare, overconfident and reckless, stops to rest and loses. A fox, unable to reach a cluster of grapes, declares them sour and walks away. A crow, flattered by a fox into opening its beak to sing, drops the piece of cheese it was holding. Each story is short, often no more than a paragraph or two, and each ends with a moral, a concise statement of the lesson embedded in the tale. But here's what's remarkable about these fables. The animals are not really animals at all. The tortoise isn't a tortoise in any meaningful biological sense. He's a stand-in for persistence, for the wisdom of slow and steady progress. The hare is arrogance. The fox is cunning. The crow is vanity meeting its just reward. Aesop's animals are archetypes. They are types of human beings, dressed in fur and feather, acting out the dramas of human moral failure and human moral virtue. The reason we project human qualities onto them, and the reason these projections are so immediately legible, is that it allows a kind of emotional and intellectual safety. When we hear that a hare lost a race because of his arrogance, we can laugh. We can nod. We can recognize the arrogant hare in ourselves or in people we know without the sting of direct accusation. This is one of the great gifts animals give to literature: plausible deniability. A writer can say things through an animal character that would be too dangerous, too painful, or too uncomfortable to say through a human one. We see this same logic operating in a completely different cultural tradition, the Panchatantra. The Panchatantra is a Sanskrit collection of interconnected animal fables believed to have been composed in India somewhere between the 3rd century BCE and the 3rd century CE. Commissioned a scholar named Vishnu Sharma to educate them. But rather than boring them with dry philosophical treatises, Vishnu Sharma taught them through stories. The Panchatantra, which translates roughly as 5 treatises or 5 strategies, was the result. The animals of the Panchatantra are vivid, complex, and often morally ambiguous in ways that Aesop's archetypes sometimes are not. There are jackals, crows, and lions who are manipulated by their supposedly loyal friends. The stories are nested inside each other. They frame a narrative containing stories containing other stories, creating a labyrinthine world in which wisdom and treachery are often indistinguishable. And the lessons are not simple. Where Aesop tends to offer clear moral takeaways, the Panchatantra is often more pragmatic, more political. It's a manual of diplomacy as much as a moral guide. Animals in this tradition don't just represent virtues and vices, they represent strategies, ways of operating in a world that is dangerous and unpredictable. The Panchatantra was translated into Persian in the 6th century, and from there into dozens of other languages, spreading across the Islamic world, into medieval Europe, and eventually influencing storytelling traditions across the globe. When you encounter a trickster animal in European folk literature, you are often, whether you know it or not, downstream of the Panchatantra. These ancient traditions established what we might call the foundational grammar of animal representation in literature: animals as moral archetypes, animals as political allegories, animals as teachers, animals as mirrors held up to reflect the truth of human behavior back at the humans who needed to see it most. This grammar would be elaborated, challenged, subverted, and enriched over the following centuries. But it never went away. It is still there underneath everything we'll discuss today. If the ancient fable tradition used animals as clear, legible moral types, the fox is cunning, the lion is powerful, the dove is peace, then the great literary tradition of the 19th century did something more complicated. It used animals as symbols. The difference might seem subtle, but it matters. The symbol as an animal resonates with people and carries meaning beyond their literal appearance, meaning that their representation is often multiple, ambiguous, and open to interpretation. And nowhere in all of Western literature is that distinction clearer than in Herman Melville's Moby-Dick. Published in 1851, Moby-Dick is, on its surface, a novel about a whaling voyage. Captain Ahab, the monomaniacal commander of the Pequod, is pursuing a specific white sperm whale. The novel follows Ishmael, our narrator, as the voyage unfolds and Ahab's obsession drives the ship toward its inevitable catastrophe. But Moby-Dick, the whale himself, is not just a whale. He is one of the most discussed, debated, analyzed, and argued over symbols in all of American literature. What does the white whale represent? Ask 10 Melville scholars, and you'll get at least a dozen answers. For some, the whale is God, or at least the idea of God. vast and indifferent and ultimately unknowable, against which human will and human ambition are helplessly, tragically inadequate. For others, the whale is nature itself, the wild, non-human world that exists entirely outside the categories of human meaning-making, and that will destroy us if we try to force our meanings onto it. For still others, the whale is the unconscious, the blank screen onto which Ahab projects all his rage, his grief, his need for an enemy, his need for meaning. Melville himself was characteristically evasive on the question, but the famous passage in which Ishmael contemplates the whale's whiteness gives us a crucial clue. Ishmael notes that white in most symbolic systems is associated with purity, innocence, and the divine. But the whiteness of the whale, he argues, has the opposite effect. It terrifies. It is the whiteness of the polar bear or the white shark. It is the color of a blank page, a blank face, a void. The whale is not a symbol of something positive or negative. It is a symbol of the terrifying possibility that the universe has no meaning at all, and that our desperate attempts to impose meaning on it are not just futile, but destructive. Ahab hunts the whale because he cannot accept that the whale that took his leg was just a whale. There has to be a reason. There has to be an enemy. And that refusal, that insistence on meaning in the face of a universe that offers none, is what kills him and almost everyone around him. The white whale is, in this reading, not a monster. It is indifference. And indifference, Melville suggests, is more frightening than any monster could be. In Edgar Allan Poe's 1845 poem The Raven is one of the most famous poems and is one of literature's great symbolic birds. The poem is deceptively simple in its setup. A grieving man, mourning the death of his beloved Lenore, is visited late one night by a raven. The raven enters through his window, perches above his door, and when questioned responds with one word, "Nevermore." The man, in his grief and his desperation, begins asking the raven increasingly anguished questions. Will he see Lenore again? Will he find peace? And the raven answers each question with the same terrible final word, "Nevermore." The raven as a bird has a long history as a symbol of ill omen, death, and dark knowledge in Western and Norse traditions. Poe draws on that tradition deliberately, but the genius of the poem is that the raven itself is completely ambiguous. It doesn't actually know anything. It's a bird. It has one word. The grieving narrator is the one who asks it questions, who invests its mechanical response with devastating meaning. The raven is a symbol not just of death and grief, but of the way the grieving mind works, the way it tortures itself by seeking confirmation of its worst fears, by asking questions it knows will only deepen the wound. In this way, Poe's raven is very different from Melville's whale, but they share something crucial. Both are animals onto which human beings project meaning. Both animals are just being themselves. The meaning belongs to the humans who encounter them. And the tragedy in both cases is that the humans cannot stop themselves from projecting. We see a version of this same dynamic in the animal symbolism of Anna Karenina, where Tolstoy uses a horse race and a dying horse to foreshadow the destruction of Vronsky and Anna's relationship. In the Metamorphosis of Gregor Samsa in Kafka's The Metamorphosis, where a man waking up as an insect becomes one of literature's most devastating explorations of alienation and family dysfunction, and in the hundreds of animals that populate the poems of Ted Hughes, hawks, crows, foxes, animals that embody the wild, amoral, vital energy that civilization tries to suppress. The 19th and 20th centuries developed a symbolic vocabulary of animals that is still alive in our literary culture today. When a contemporary novelist puts a significant animal in a scene, a fox glimpsed in a garden, an owl calling in the night, they are drawing on this deep well of accumulated symbolic meaning. There are politically charged animal literature we'll turn to next. If there is one book that most people immediately think of when they think of politically charged animal literature, it is George Orwell's Animal Farm. Published in 1945, Animal Farm is an allegory, a sustained, systematic comparison between two sets of things in which every element in one domain corresponds to an element in the other. In this case, Orwell maps the history of the Soviet Union from the Russian Revolution through the Stalinist purges onto a farm in England where the animals stage a revolt against their human owner, Mr. Jones, an attempt to create a society founded on the principles of equality and solidarity. The parallels are precise. The pigs, led first by Napoleon and Snowball, correspond to the Bolshevik leadership, with Napoleon clearly representing Stalin and Snowball clearly representing Trotsky. Boxer, the enormous, good-hearted, naive workhorse who devotes himself utterly to the revolution and meets a tragic end, represents the working class. Those whose labor makes the revolution possible, and who are ultimately betrayed by the very leaders they trusted. The sheep who mindlessly bleat the party slogans represent the easily manipulated masses. The famous conclusion, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, gradually transforming into 4 legs good, 2 legs better, as the pigs begin to walk upright and ally themselves with the humans they once overthrew. This is one of literature's great images of political corruption. The revolutionaries become the thing they revolted against. Power corrupts even in a world of talking pigs. Orwell chose the animal allegory for very practical reasons. He had difficulty finding a publisher for Animal Farm. Several publishers in Britain and America rejected it, fearing it would offend the Soviet Union, which was at that point a British ally. The Animal Farm gave the book a kind of deniability. It was just a fairy tale after all, just a story about a farm. But of course, everyone who read it understood exactly what it was about. This is the ancient function of the animal fable, that plausible deniability deployed in a modern political context with devastating effectiveness. But Orwell wasn't the first to use animals as a vehicle for social criticism. In fact, he was working in a tradition that extends back decades before Animal Farm. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, published in 1906, is technically not an animal allegory. It's a naturalistic novel about Lithuanian immigrants working in the Chicago meatpacking industry. But animals are central to it in a different and equally disturbing way. Sinclair's point, made with relentless, almost punishing detail, is that the system of industrial capitalism treats human workers like animals. The men and women who work in the meatpacking plants are processed, used up, and discarded with the same indifference as the cattle and pigs they slaughter. The animal body and the human body become interchangeable in the logic of the industrial system. Both are just meat. Sinclair intended The Jungle as a socialist critique, a call for the protection of workers' rights and the nationalization of industry. What he actually achieved was the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, because readers were so horrified by his descriptions of the meat processing. The contamination, the diseased animals, the unsanitary conditions. There was a national outcry about the food supply, not about the workers. Sinclair famously said, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." The novel's use of animals is not allegorical but structural. Animals are the product. Workers are treated like animals. The horror of the book lies in the collapse of the boundary between the two. William Golding's Lord of the Flies, published in 1954, takes a different approach. Here, the animal is not present as a literal figure, but as a potential, the possibility of animality within the human. A group of British schoolboys stranded on a deserted island gradually abandon the conventions of civilization and descend into tribalism, violence, and murder. The pig hunts that increasingly dominate the boys' lives are frenzied, ritualistic killings. And that becomes more important to them than rescue. These are Golding's image of the beast within. The animal is what we become when the thin veneer of civilization is stripped away. The Lord of the Flies himself, the pig's head on a stick, speaks to Simon in a vision, and what it says is this: "You knew, didn't you? I'm part of you." The beast is not the pig. The beast is the boys. The animal is inside us. This is one of the darkest uses of animal representation in all of literature. Not the animal as teacher or symbol or mirror, but the animal as what we fear we truly are. In the final decades of the 20th century and the early years of the 21st, something shifted in literary animal representation. Writers began to question the very premise of the tradition we've been tracing. If animals in literature have always been fundamentally about humans, then what has been lost? What does it mean to use animals as vehicles for human stories? Jan Martel's Life of Pi, published in 2001, takes a more explicitly philosophical approach to the human-animal relationship. The novel's premise is audacious. Pai Patel, a 16-year-old Indian boy who grew up in his family's zoo in Pondicherry, survives a shipwreck and spends 227 days in a lifeboat in the Pacific Ocean in the company of a Bengal tiger named Richard Parker. The tiger is real. He is a zoo animal who survived the wreck, and Pai's survival depends entirely on his ability to train and manage the tiger. To use his knowledge of animal behavior, honed in the zoo, to establish dominance over an animal that could kill him at any moment. Richard Parker never becomes a pet, never becomes a friend in any simple sense. He remains what he is, a wild animal who is magnificent and utterly himself. But he and Pai develop a relationship that is neither friendship nor domination, but a kind of mutual acknowledgement. They keep each other alive, and when they finally reach land and Richard Parker walks into the jungle without a backward glance, Pai weeps. This is the final reminder of everything Pai has had to accept in order to survive. Martel uses the tiger to explore the problem of narrative and meaning-making. The novel's famous twist, a second version of the story in which the tiger and the other animals are replaced by human beings acting with savage cruelty, raises the possibility that the animal story was a fiction Pai invented to make an unbearable human reality bearable. The animals gave him a distance from horror that allowed him to survive it. But Martel refuses to confirm this interpretation. Both versions of the story are offered to the reader, and the reader is asked to choose. Which story do you prefer? The novel's narrator asks the official investigators who have heard Pai's tale. The answer, Martel suggests, is that we prefer the version with the tiger. We prefer the animal story, and that preference, that deep human need for the animal as a companion in our narratives, is itself one of the novel's deepest subjects. In Caribbean and African literary traditions, animal representation carries additional layers of meaning that are shaped by the specific histories of colonialism, slavery, and the suppression of indigenous knowledge systems. The trickster figures of West African folklore, Anansi the spider, the tortoise, and the hare, were brought to the Americas through the Middle Passage, where they took root in new soil and became the basis for a rich tradition of African American folk tales. Joel Chandler Harris collected some of these stories in the late 19th century as the Brer Rabbit Tales, and despite the deeply problematic framing of his collection, the stories themselves encode a genuine tradition of resistance. Brer Rabbit, small, vulnerable, surrounded by bigger and stronger animals, survives by wit and cunning. He cannot win by force. He wins by being smarter than those who would exploit him. This is the animal as survivor, the animal as coded resistance, the animal carrying within its fictional form the lived experience of people who had to find ways to outwit a system designed to destroy them. Contemporary writers in the new nature writing movement are continuing to push on the boundaries of what animal representation can do, asking harder questions about what we owe to non-human lives, about who gets to speak for animals in literature, and about what the long history of using animals as metaphors for human experience says about our relationship to the actual living world. So, we've traveled a long way, from the moral archetypes of Aesop and the Panchatantra, through the great symbolic creatures of Melville and Poe, through the political allegories of Orwell and the social critiques of Sinclair and Golding, to the complex, morally serious animal encounters Martel and the resistant tricksters of the African diaspora. What does all of this tell us? I think it tells us something both simple and profound, that human beings are not comfortable being alone in the universe. We need companions in our stories. We need other beings to talk to think with, to measure ourselves against. And animals, those who share our world, who lived alongside us before language, before civilization, before literature, have been those companions from the very beginning. But our use of animals in literature also carries a shadow. When we use a whale to symbolize the search for meaning, when we use pigs to stand in for Soviet bureaucrats, when we use animals as metaphors and archetypes and political allegories, we are doing something to them. We are making them into instruments of human meaning-making. We are, in a sense, using them, just as we use them in so many other ways. The most thoughtful animal literature of the past few decades has begun to grapple honestly with this. Writers like the ones we have already spoken of are asking what it would mean to take the animal's own perspective seriously. To let the whale be a whale, to let the tiger be a tiger, not as an instrument of our meaning, but as a being with its own reality, its own form of existence, its own claim on our attention and our care. This is, I think, where the tradition is heading, not away from animals in literature, but toward a deeper, more honest engagement with what they actually are. Toward a literature that uses animals not just as mirrors or symbols or political vehicles, but as genuine subjects in their own right. That's a harder kind of writing. It requires writers to sit with the mystery of another kind of consciousness, to resist the temptation to explain, to symbolize, to make everything mean something in human terms. But it's also a richer and more truthful kind of writing, and it may turn out to be one of the most important kinds of writing we can do in a century when the relationship between human beings and the rest of the living world is more urgent and more fraught than it has ever been before. Thank you so much for listening to the Resilient Animal podcast, and please check our show notes at theresilientanimal.buzzsprout.com. If today's episode sparked a thought, a memory, or a new book you want to pick up, I'd love to hear about it. And if you're enjoying the show, please share it with someone who loves animals as much as you do. Until next time, keep listening to what the animals are trying to tell you.